Hello, everybody, and welcome again to our continuing series focused on Trump on Trade. Today's webinar is titled Navigating the New Global Trade Operating System. First of all, I want to welcome those of you who have attended previous sessions, so welcome back. For those of you who are new, welcome. As I mentioned, this is our fourth in the series, and certainly the way things are going will definitely not be our last. So the way things are going, most likely we'll probably be having another one of these in another week or two, because our last one that we had was, correct me if I'm wrong, Angela, 2 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken.
Pretty much, yep.
So again, welcome. So there's a lot to cover in the next 30 minutes. So before we get started, a couple of housekeeping, obviously, because this is we want this to be as informative as possible. So feel free to ask any and all questions in the chat. Speaking of that, we are going to change the format up a bit, which I'm going to get to here in a second when we get to the agenda slide. But housekeeping first, I want to, on behalf of all of us, I want to apologize for the confusion around the time. We had an issue with Teams that was throwing off the actual time of the meeting. So again, I want to just apologize for the confusion that it may have created. The other thing I wanted to just stress is that just shows the importance of data as well as dates. So I want to thank our marketing department for that joke. They're the ones that threw that in. So you can thank Ben Haddock, who heads up our marketing department. So with that said, if we want to go to the agenda, as I mentioned, we've got 30 minutes. We're gonna spend covering a number of topics. The agenda, real quick, is going to be, I'm going to provide a brief update, which actually is kind of long considering what has happened over the last 2 weeks alone. And then we're going to change the format a bit. As I mentioned, we're going to have more of a Q&A. If you've if you've attended our last sessions, it's been more of Angela walking through, a specific topic and showing the reports that we've created. Today, it's going to be more of a Q&A. So as I mentioned before, feel free and please do ask any and all questions, because you'll see the questions that we've answered, or excuse me, that we're asking and addressing today have been asked by not only about our customers, but also, lots of conversation on the same topics on LinkedIn, in the general trade community. So again, I'm sure many of these questions, if not all of them, are being discussed around your kitchen table as well. And then at the end, time allowing, Angela is going to show, we have a new KPI dashboard that Angela wants to show. And then we'll discuss what's next, which again, considering how things have been going, is going to be, what's going to transpire, what has transpired over the next week or two. So with that said, we can move to the, actually, before we get started, I jumped ahead a bit. Just kind of where we're at today versus where we're at even 2 weeks ago. So during our last webinar, even there was an announcement about the auto tariffs that came out. So again, it's no longer a running joke. It just goes to show you how quickly things are changing and how fast things are changing. So again, I think with today's webinar, right, all bets are off regarding what might come out during this webinar or later. So again, as we like to say, the tariff situation is subject to change even by the end of this call. So again, at the end of the 30 minutes, most likely all of us will be checking LinkedIn and our other sources to see what new announcement has possibly come out from the White House regarding tariffs. So just a real quick recap on what's transpired since we last met. Number one, Liberation Day, as we all know, has come and gone. Liberation Day has taken different forms that was initially announced, as we all know. There's been a tariff pause on the negotiations, with right now a 10% universal tariff applied on most goods coming to the United States, with some exceptions, obviously, which we'll talk about, China in particular. Word has it that right now there's quote unquote 130 countries now at the negotiation table, which I think we believe that that was Trump's ultimate intent, is to possibly get a 10% universal tariff in place, but he started the negotiations high. So we'll see how that goes over the next couple of weeks. Even as of today, the EU has backed off their retaliatory tariffs. On another area, tariff stacking. I'm going to say tariff stacking has gone wild, which Angela is going to address during the Q&A section. We now have the back and forth with tariffs, with China tariffs reaching 145% as of this webinar. and the Trump administration's continuing attempt to decouple from China. We have sector-specific tariffs, which we'll touch on. We have now the Trump administration looking at exempting auto parts. We now have Trump who is looking at or has exempted electronics for the time being. Again, it's temporary, according to the White House. And then last but not least, we have the latest on the Section 232s, which again, we're going to talk about a little bit today, including the most recent announcement, which is the Trump administration announcing two new investigations, one in the pharmaceutical industry and the other one into semiconductors or electronics, as we mentioned. So I think the message is quite clear, is that the tariff uncertainty is going to continue to last for the foreseeable future. No industry right now is safe from tariffs, but no industry knows exactly what their final tariffs are going to be, which is again is creating a lot of uncertainty, and creates a lot of angst and grief for all of you on the phone. So before we go into the next slide, again, we do appreciate you taking 30 minutes out of your day today, because we do realize how swamped everybody is with dealing with tariffs. So we certainly hope that today's session is going to be informative, and that you get a lot out of it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Angela to start, and for her to cover, what resources are available that you can access to stay on top of the tariff situation and the changes that are occurring on a daily basis. So Angela?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And so everyone is aware, these hyperlinks that are on the slide have also been added to the chat. So if you're interested in reviewing any of those, you can also copy them from the chat. So what you're looking at here, these 3 bullet points, these are the official publications. And so, we'll see posts on Truth Social by President Trump. He'll give speeches. He'll talk about things he intends to do. But until we see the published guidance, we don't always have the details. We don't understand, okay, how is that actually going to be implemented? What does that actually mean for the trade? And so here are the 3 links that you'll find most of the information that you need to kind of really understand what's going on, what's been discussed versus what's reality. And so the CSMS, this is the customs messaging service. From that link, you can see prior CSMS alert messages that have been published by CBP. You can register for a free email subscription. And this is instructions that CBP sends out to customs brokers and any other interested parties, like software companies, importers, that provide the updates when there's a new Chapter 99 HTS code for a new tariff program, when there's a new exception or an exemption or a change in a date, anything that impacts the way customs brokers file customs entries, like the nuts and bolts of the mechanics of it. You're seeing those alerts in the CSMS, and that's a free service for anyone interested. The second bullet here is the Federal Register. And this is not just for CBP, this is all federal agencies. It can be really, truly nerdy if you're into legal requirements or changes in agency governance. Basically, any law changes, they're being published here in the Federal Register. And so when there's new changes in the tariffs, when there's implementing language, then it's published in the Federal Register, and we call it an FRN, a Federal Register Notice. So every time there's the list of HTS codes that are exempt from reciprocal tariffs, when they're announcing what Chapter 99 codes are going to be declared and what the rates are and what the dates are, the most detailed implementing language that's published is the Federal Register copy. And then there's also executive orders, and we've seen these used very frequently by the Trump administration. A lot of times when he gives the speeches, when he talks about executive orders, there's fact sheets, there's memos, the trade policy that was published literally on Inauguration Day. All of that is available on whitehouse.gov. These are all free resources. They're all available on the web. You can download them. There's no requirement, or need, but if you're curious of where the official language come from that customs brokers, consultants, lawyers, everyone's relying on, these are the links to our official sources.
Yeah. Or you could use your Ouija board.
A dart board, a Ouija board.
Yes.
Speak and say.
But all jokes aside, thanks for that. And I don't think you mentioned it, but for the audience members, the links are provided in the chat. So you should be able to access them there, and then access the links off of the chat. So with that, let's move on to the question and the questions that we want to cover. As I mentioned in the opening, a lot of these questions are from our current customers, but again, as you can imagine, they're very topical. They're very top of mind. We've also pulled those from, our research, especially Angela and the work that she's been doing and staying on top of the tariffs and what we feel is most important, at least to cover during this webinar. And then obviously what's being discussed in the trade and in LinkedIn in particular. So with that said, let's go to the first question. So what does the current 90-day pause mean?
Great question. So there was the big speech that I'm sure everyone's aware of, familiar with in the Rose Garden, where Trump had the big signs and he said, these are the countries and these are the reciprocal rates. So those rates, the lowest rate was 10%. And if you were not on one of those boards, you were going to have a 10% tariff. If you were on one of those boards, then your country specific rate was going to start on the 9th of April. And so when the 9th came around, there were countries that were 11%, there were countries that were up to 50%. It was whatever your country of origin was, that was going to determine your tariff rate. And there was a lot of market reaction to that. There was a lot of complexity for brokers and importers and for everyone involved to kind of wrap their heads around, what does this mean to me? What's the cost impact? And so we don't know all the reasons why, we don't have a crystal ball, but there was an announcement by the Trump administration. It was followed behind by official guidance that he was pausing those country specific rates for 90 days. And so what that means is instead of China being subject to 34% and Vietnam being subject to this amount and India being subject to that amount, every country, except for China, and we'll come back to China, but every country is going to stay at that 10% tariff rate through that 90-day pause. And that's through the 8th of July. And so there was not a full pause on tariffs. The reciprocal tariffs weren't, completely halted, but they were left at that initial 10% rate instead of increasing to the country specific rates. The only exception there is China, and China was given a 125% reciprocal tariff rate. They didn't pause to 10% like everyone else. You may have also heard the 145%. That's the sum of the IEEPA reciprocal 20% plus the IEEPA fentanyl 20% plus the IEEPA reciprocal 125%. That's a tongue twister. But yeah, China is 125. Everyone else is 10% through July 8th.
Thanks. And even with the 10%, as I mentioned earlier, that with the 130 some odd countries at the negotiation table, I mean, that 10% is even subject to change, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Nothing's a guarantee at this point.
Yeah, nothing is certainly set in stone. So the next question. How are the dates calculated for reciprocal country of origin China tariffs?
So we go down a rabbit hole very quickly with the supply chain and global trade. The date is April 9th. Okay, great. What does April 9th mean? Is that when it leaves origin? Is that when it arrives in the United States? How do I determine this thing? So for China, and this applies to the other countries, but China has the bigger jump from 0 to 10 to 125. So China's getting a lot more attention than the other countries. But really the starting focus is when your shipment was leaving origin. So if you've got China origin freight that was loaded on a vessel before April 5th, that's really key, is that it was loaded on a vessel, it's arriving in the US on a vessel prior to April 5th, then there's no reciprocal tariff. You have to arrive in the US by the end of May. But as long as you were loaded prior to April 5th, you arrive by the end of May, you can apply an exception, not pay any tariff. If the goods were loaded on a vessel in China between April 5th and April 8th, those pay the 10% tariff. So it's only a 3-day window. There's going to be a limited benefit from that. But if you loaded between the 5th and the 8th, 10%, it's a whole lot better than paying 125. And then if it was loaded on the vessel in China on April 9th or later, then you're locked into that 125% rate. Other modes of transport, air, rail, truck, like let's say you had some country of origin China goods that were maybe being stored in Canada or Mexico, that's based on the day that they left origin, and that's probably going to put you in the 125 range. But if you were able to load your freight prior to April 5th or prior to April 9th, it's worth looking into whether or not you're applying that exception to not pay the China tariff.
You were already 2 questions in, and my head's already starting to spin. So I can only imagine how the audience feels. And we haven't even gotten to the next two, which are just all about complexity. So, which is brings me to the third question: is yeah, how does tariff stacking work?
Tariff stacking. That's a big word that you're seeing buzz. Like even media is starting to pick up the word stacking. And I look at the tariffs. There's so many tariffs that have come at us all at once. And we saw some during Trump's first administration. He implemented Section 301 on certain China origin goods based on the HTS code. There's a Section 232 that's based on HTS code. And so what that's basically doing is you're stacking all of these tariffs on top of each other. So if you've been importing, for 15, 20 years, you're familiar with most favored nation. That's the tariff rate that everybody pays. It's based on your HTS code. And you've kind of learned that to be a cost of doing business to import into the US. It's a vehicle, maybe you're paying 2.5%. You've got plastic components, maybe 3 or 4%. So that's your first, brick really is, or your block is the most favored nation. And then if you're importing from China, maybe you're adding a block for 301. Maybe you're adding a block for IEPA fentanyl. You've got a block for reciprocal. You've got a block for fentanyl. And so every one of these tariff programs basically stacks on top of each other to where when you sum all of their tariff rates together, you get your effective rate. Your stacking is basically summing. If I've got 20% plus 25% plus 125%, you add all those together, that's your tariff stack. That's the total effective duty rate that you're going to pay.
Actually, I'm going to, if you don't mind, Angela, we got to ask a really good question in the chat that I think now might be a good time to ask it. So the question is how is CBP keeping up with all these changes, and will we, the importer shipper, be penalized even if there is a delay from CBP's side?
That is a legitimate risk, and it's one where you really want to exercise what they call your reasonable care. CBP is in an age of enforcement. They've got very sophisticated tools. They use AI analytics. They're looking at all the data. But part of the challenge for CBP and importers alike is a lot of these tariff programs were implemented very quickly. There's been times where we see an announcement on a Friday and the tariffs are live by Monday, Tuesday of the following week. There just simply isn't time for CBP to build their ACE software, their customs entry filing software fast enough to keep up with all of the trends. And so what we see happening a lot is CBP, sets up these HTS codes, they set up these duty rates, but they don't necessarily have all the validations in place. So your customs broker could file with their best analysis of what they think was the right sequencing, the right HTS codes and duty rates. But if there's an error, CBP isn't always consistently rejecting those imports today. They may accept the entry, they may accept the duty calculation, you pay your duties, and you think everything's good. Like, I trust my broker, CBP accepted it, I'm done. But if CBP's, goes back later and they run their audit tools, you could receive a CF-28 request for information. You could, receive a reject message later, or, some other notification to where CBP is like, hey, can you explain to us how you arrived at this declaration? Why you applied this exception, or, why you calculated this tariff rate? And if they find an error later, they can require that the entry be updated, and the importer, if it increases the duties, that you pay those additional duties with interest. So it can be a little overwhelming. It can be a little scary to think, well, wow, I'm giving all the documents and the data to my broker. How do I know it's right? And we can have conversations about that, reporting around that. Like, these webinars help to a certain extent too, to educate you on what the rules and the requirements are. And we do anticipate that CBP will continue to enhance their their validations, the software companies that the brokers rely on, the ABI software, ClearNow. We're all putting those controls in place too, to make sure that those bumpers are up and that there's post-entry auditing going on, exception management going on. But given the velocity of how quickly this is happening, that there is possibility that CBP will accept something and they'll come back later and say, no, we changed our mind.
Okay, which is actually a great segue into the next question that was asked along the same line. So this question is what if the goods shipped when the reciprocal tariffs were higher and then reduced at a later date? Can the reduced later tariff be applied?
That one gets a little tricky because CBP is really looking at what are the rules in place on the day that the goods are released. So a lot of times, especially with ocean freight, your customs broker is going to pre-clear, and the CBP will give you a release date up to 5 days prior to arrival. But what they're really pegging to, okay, what are the rules? What date matters most? It's whatever date CBP returns as your release date. So if you leave origin and there's no reciprocal tariffs, and then while it's on the water, it goes up to 125%, and then let's say a week before it arrives, it goes down to 10%. You're required to use the rules in place on the day that the goods arrive, the day they're released. You would end up paying the 10%. But let's say the rules on your release date were like with China, that 125% reciprocal rate. That's what you end up paying. If a month later, 2 weeks later, CBP says, no, we're going to drop it, you can't recover those duties because those were the duties that were in place on the day that they were entered into the US. But there are some strategies that you can play with here. Some of them more sophisticated than others. Like we've had importers that have admitted goods into foreign trade zones. Foreign trade zones lock in your duty rate on that date. So unless you're going to re-export the goods, foreign trade zones really help you avoid the duties, but they do lock the rate. Bonded warehouse can be a way to store goods and wait for a tariff rate change before you admit into commerce. We've also seen customers that they're unlading their goods in the US and they're moving them in bond up to Canada and putting them in a bonded warehouse or distributing through Canada, waiting to see what happens with the tariffs. Because the day those goods cross from Canada into the US or from Mexico into the US, that's the day that the tariffs are what are the rules on that day? So there's a little bit of gambling involved in it, a little speculation in terms of what tariffs are going to do. But really it depends on what the rules are on the day of release. And so if there's a rule that says, hey, if you loaded a vessel on or before a certain day, then that's going to play into the equation. But if they say, this is the rate for this day, then that's kind of where you're locked. You're typically not able to go back retroactively unless there is a rate change that is announced with a retroactive clause.
In a typical CBP fashion, the onus is always on the importer or the shipper.
Yes.
Always. All right, so I'm keeping an eye on time. So if we want to go to our next question, which is, I've been flagged for Section 232, but I don't have any metal derivatives in my product. What should I do?
So Section 232, this started with Trump's first administration with steel and aluminum. There were a number of countries that had exceptions. Those exceptions have gone away in Trump's current administration. He's expanded the number of HTS codes that are subject to Section 232. We talked about steel, aluminum, automobiles, auto parts are starting in May the 3rd. But with Section 232, some of the steel and aluminum, it really depends on your HTS code. Some of the steel and aluminum, you have to pay that 25% tariff on the entire value. Others HTS codes are what they're calling derivative. And those are imports where the Trump administration anticipates there could be some metal, but it's not the majority of the content. And so they're not going to make you pay a 25% tariff on, goods that 80-90% of it doesn't contain that metal. And so if you're on the derivative list and you only have to pay the tariff based on the metal content, then there's possibilities. And I've seen a lot of these scenarios myself that there just isn't any metal, where statistically speaking, the Trump administration thought this HTS code would contain metal, but it just doesn't. And so when that happens, the broker has to declare 232. They have to acknowledge the 232 flag, but they acknowledge it with zero value. There's no tariff assessed. And there's an added bonus if you're on that derivative list and you have zero metal. Not only are you not paying 232, but there's a reciprocal exception that if you flag for 232, you do not have to pay the reciprocal. So in this case, if you flag 232 derivative, you have zero metal. Now you're paying 232 and zero reciprocal.
So complexity on top of complexity on top of complexity.
That too. There can be savings, but you really have to kind of drill deep and kind of become an overnight expert.
What a time to be in trade compliance. All right, so the next topic is something that's, because of all of this, is gaining a lot of attention recently, and that has to do with bonds. So our next question is what do I need to do to ensure bond sufficiency?
Yeah, so, if you've been in the trade for a while, the minimum bond amount is $50,000, and it's, basically assessed at what's 10% of my annual duties and taxes. And that's been the rule, forever and ever. And companies look at, okay, what did I spend last year? what am I forecasting my volume for this year? Maybe I give it a little bit of an uplift cushion to make sure I've set my bond in a reasonable place. And then you renew it every year. And it can become, kind of a well-oiled machine, especially with consistent business. Historically, you've kind of known where to set your bond amount. But with all of these new tariffs, that's increasing the amount of that total duties and tariffs and taxes that you're paying. And you can't always forecast. No one can forecast. Who could have expected 125% on China on top of everything else? But that's increasing the amount that you're going to be paying to customs. And so if your bond was calculated expecting a lower duty and tax amount, once you reach the amount that your bond was approved for, then you could be dinged with a bond insufficiency notice, where customs is coming to you and saying, hey, you can't import anymore until you increase your bond amount. Your surety company is going to need to expand the amount of coverage you have. And so there's a lot of, I would say, gamification that could go on here too, Kevin, in terms of, okay, well, what's the best algorithm? What's the best formula to get to an appropriate bond amount? And, that's, a conversation for another day, but it's something to definitely keep an eye on is what, is your current bond amount? How much have you imported against that bond? Are you at risk? Maybe having those proactive conversations with your surety company. Do I have underwriting that gets triggered at a certain point? Are you going to need copies of my financial documents? Those are all things that could be impacted by this additional tariff cost. It's one thing to impact your bottom line, and that's really hard to cover that cost. But then the other side of it is you also have this bond, and if you exceed that bond limit, then that can increase bond premiums. It can increase underwriting. It can slow down your ability, your velocity to import if you've hit that cap and need to, get back under it. So it's definitely something, if you haven't looked into your bond sufficiency, it would be timely to have that conversation. If you're not sure where to start, reach out to us. We're happy to help. But we anticipate that, as the dust starts to settle, as customs gets more comfortable with all of these new tariffs, they're also going to be looking at the bond sufficiency, and the importers that are significantly impacted by the tariffs are probably the first ones that are going to get triggered for sufficiency notices.
Yeah, so just one more. I hate to use the word casualty, but I'll use it anyway. That's an area that's been impacted and people really haven't thought about for the longest time, but now it's also front and center.
Yeah.
All right. So the next question then, before we close out here, is what are the next set of important dates I should plan around? I know we mentioned the 90-day pause, but I believe there's some dates in between now and then, correct?
There are, yeah. So the 90-day pause takes us to about July 8th. So those country-specific rates that, were announced in the Rose Garden, we could see those come back in July. We could see those adjusted based on the negotiations that are ongoing between the U.S. government and the foreign governments. Anything could happen between now and July 8th, but that's a big milestone we're watching. But also, if you import any automotive parts, parts of light vehicles or trucks, passenger vehicles and light trucks, those Section 232 tariffs, 25% begin on May 3rd. And so that could be a new tariff, additional cost for your bottom line, for your bond sufficiency. So May 3rd there. The de minimis on China, if you're importing any low value shipments under $800, a lot of e-commerce uses de minimis. That's going away for China on May 3rd. So then you'd have to file a formal entry, have 10-digit HTS codes, pay duties, pay all these tariffs. Definitely something to be mindful of. And something I haven't heard a lot of discussion from the Trump administration yet. I don't mean this to be a jinx, but I just want everyone to be mindful. If you're importing from China, the Section 301 tariffs that were implemented during Trump's first administration, that were expanded actually under President Biden, those exceptions, there's not a whole lot of exceptions left, but the list of exceptions are set to expire on May 31st. And given the current landscape, the current, interpretations of tariffs by the Trump administration, they could expand those, or they could expand a limited subset. They could let them all expire. And so if you're not sure if you're using 301 tariff exceptions, that could be a 7.5% to 25% tariff avoidance that could then become a tariff cost starting, after May 31st. So something definitely to look into, be familiar with how you're impacted by 301 to see if there could be any, impact to your business starting in June.
Okay, great. So that brings us to the bottom of the hour. Yeah, the 30 minutes, as we knew, flew by. There was a lot of information. This webinar is recorded. So for all of the attendees and all the registrants, we will be sending out the link for the recording so you can watch it and play it back at your leisure. I think going forward in terms of what's next, I think uncertainty is still the word of the day. I'll also, the advice I gave my kid when he was learning how to drive was expect the unexpected, and I think that's certainly the times that we're still living in and will for the foreseeable future. So in terms of what's next, I guess the best advice is stay tuned. As we said at the end of our last webinar, most likely we're going to have another webinar, which has led us to this one today, which is our fourth. Guarantee that we'll probably have a fifth and not a sixth and possibly a seventh, depending on how things progress and the tariffs are rolled out or rolled back over the next number of months. But stay tuned for the next webinar announcement. Once again, thank you for everybody for attending. And certainly if you have any questions, which we didn't get to them all today, and the ones that were asked were great questions, feel free to reach out to us. There's a number of ways you can get in touch with us. Current customers that are on the phone, feel free to reach out to your customer success contact, or feel free to reach out to Angela directly or myself directly, and we'll certainly get answers. So once again, thank you for attending today's webinar, and we will see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.